Progressive Skills in English, Level 4 Coursebook by Terry Phillips and Anna Phillips. Copyright Garnet Publishing Ltd. 2012. 1.1 Theme 1 Geography and the Modern World. Lesson 1.1 Vocabulary for Listening, the HDI. Exercise B1. Listen to Extract 1. Check your ideas from Exercise A.
Now I'd like you to look at this map, and I want you to notice the colours in particular. What do they represent? Well, the map shows human development for every country in the world. We'll look at exactly what we mean by human development later in the lecture. Now, every year, the United Nations Development Programme looks at human development in every country in the world. So this UN programme produces an index of human development, the HDI, or Human Development Index.
(1.2) Exercise B2. Listen to Extract 2. What questions does the UN ask about each country?
According to the UNDP, we can measure human development in a particular country by finding answers to 4 questions. The first one is this, and it's very simple. How long in that country can people expect to live? This is called life expectancy. In some countries, life expectancy can be as high as 80 years of age. In the poorest countries of the world, it is only about 40 years old. Now the second question, what percentage of people can read and write? In other words, what is the level of literacy in the country? Here in the UK, the literacy rate is 99%. In Afghanistan, however, it is only 28% of the population. Our third question is linked to the second question about literacy. How many years of education do children receive? The important thing here is the enrollment rate at each level. What percentage of children complete primary, secondary, and tertiary education? And finally, the fourth question. Any ideas what it is? No? Well, it's this. What is the average income per person? We call this the standard of living. It is measured by dividing the total income of the country by the total population. The total income is sometimes called gross domestic product or GDP. When we divide by the population, we get GDP per person or per capita, as we say. So our 4 questions are about life expectancy, literacy, education, and income, or standard of living.
(1.3) Exercise B3. Listen to Extract 3. Why does the lecturer mention the following? A. Canada. B. Norway. C. Sierra Leone. D. Natural resources. E. Location. F. Fresh water.
Now, at the beginning of this lecture, I asked you to notice the colours on the map. Let's think about what they represent. Countries with the highest human development achieve scores of around 0.9 or 90%. Examples include the USA and Canada and several countries in Northern Europe. In fact, Norway is number 1 in the world on the HDI. So these are the dark green countries on the map. Countries with very low development score only 0.3 or 0.4, 30 to 40%. Several countries in Africa are in this category, including Sierra Leone, which in 2010 was ranked 177 in the world. As you can see, these countries are coloured red, orange, or brown. So what are the similarities between the dark green countries, the ones with the high HDI? Is it their location in the world and their climate? Is it their natural resources? Is it their style of government? And what about the poorest countries in the world? What factors do they have in common? It could be population, poor agricultural land, or a lack of fresh water. I want you to consider these ideas and
1.4 Lesson 1.2 Real-Time Listening, Qatar and Lebanon.
Right, so today we are looking at the effect of geography on human development. I'm going to focus on two small countries in the Middle East. Next time, by the way, we'll look at two large countries. This week, the two countries are Qatar and Lebanon. Now, first, I'll explain how we can divide the main information about a country, like location, etc., into subheadings. Then I'll compare the two countries in terms of each subheading. And finally, I'm going to tell you the rating of each country on the United Nations Human Development Index. And I'm going to ask you to consider this question. Does the geography of each country affect the human development of its population? There are many similarities between the countries, but there are also some differences. Perhaps these differences affect human development. Now, I've given you a handout to fill in today. Can you get that out? Right. As you can see, I'm going to look at 5 key headings for each country. Together, these points give us a picture of the country. The key points are location, population, land, climate, and natural resources. And we can divide each of these headings into subheadings. I'd like you to fill in the subheadings. So under location, we have region and borders. We could have latitude and longitude as well, but region and borders are fine for us today. Secondly, population. Under this heading, we look at 3 points: the total population, the density, and the urban-rural split. I just want to make sure you understand the special terms in this section. Density means the average number of people per square kilometre. Some countries have a very high density, small countries with a large population, for example. And some countries have a very low population density. Urban means living in a town, and rural means living in the country. The urban-rural split, therefore, is the percentage of people who live in towns compared with the percentage who live in the country. Thirdly, land. Obviously, we need to know the area, but more important, really, is the amount of agricultural land. That's a percentage, of course. Some countries have a lot of agricultural land, but some have deserts or mountains, so the amount is very small. Finally, in this section, fresh water, that is, lakes and rivers. This last one is particularly important because of the global shortage of water nowadays. Next, yes, climate. Well, we start with type. Now, as you know, there are a number of main types, like temperate or desert. Then there's average rainfall, that's an annual figure usually, and temperature range, from 1 degree Celsius to 24 degrees Celsius, for example. Finally, natural resources. Some people include things like forests in natural resources. In other words, things above the ground. But in this analysis, I'm only going to consider resources under the ground. There are 2 main types of underground natural resources. They are fossil fuels and minerals. Fossil fuels are things we can burn, like oil, gas, and coal. Minerals are things like iron, gold, and copper. Oh, sorry, there is one more section, isn't there? Human development index. But we'll come to that at the very end. Okay, so I hope you've got the subheadings now. Now, we are going to compare 2 countries using these headings and subheadings. Both countries are in the Middle East, but Qatar is in the Gulf, whereas Lebanon is at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. Qatar is a peninsula, only bordered to the south by Saudi Arabia, while Lebanon is almost completely surrounded by Syria. Has anybody been to Qatar? No? Well, it is an extremely interesting place. It's a Muslim country, of course, with a very open outlook on the world, lots of modern buildings and wide roads. Lebanon is also an extremely interesting place. The capital, Beirut, was once called the Paris of the East because it is beautiful and very cosmopolitan. I mean, there are many different nationalities there and many religions. Does the location of these countries affect their human development? Right, so, population. We're going to look at the total, then the density, and finally, the urban-rural split. Firstly, the total size. And neither country has a large population, but Lebanon's is 3 times the size of Qatar's. Qatar has 1.5 million people, while the Lebanon has around 4.3 million. This difference in population is reflected in density. Qatar has 120 people per square kilometres, while Lebanon's is 413 per square kilometre. The people of both countries live mainly in the towns. 96% of Qataris are urban. They live mainly in the capital, Doha, whereas the figure for the Lebanese is 87%. Do any of these points about population affect the human development of this country? Thirdly, land. We've got area in total, and the amount of that land which is agricultural. We also need to consider fresh water, lakes and rivers in each country. So, neither country is large in area. In fact, they are almost the same size. Qatar comprises 11,400 square kilometres, while the Lebanon is slightly smaller at 10,400 square kilometres. Qatar does not have much agricultural land because most of the country is desert, but Lebanon has a great deal of land for cultivation. Finally, in this category, Qatar has no fresh water, literally none. The country relies on desalination, getting fresh water from salt water. Lebanon, on the other hand, has a water surplus. Do any of these points about land area and usage affect the human development of this country? Fourthly, climate. Here we are interested in the basic type in the average rainfall and in the temperature range. So first, type. One country, Qatar, has a desert climate. This means hot, dry summers and warm, dry winters. By contrast, Lebanon has a Mediterranean climate. This means hot, dry summers and cool, rainy winters. So, both countries have hot, dry summers, but Qatar is also warm and dry in winter, whereas Lebanon has cool, rainy winters. Rainfall in Qatar averages less than 75 millimetres per annum, while Lebanon has around 825 millimetres a year. Both countries have a similar temperature range, but Qatar goes from 15 to 40 degrees Celsius, while Lebanon's range is 5 to 38. So Qatar is much hotter all year round. Does the climate of either country affect human development? Finally, natural resources. With regard to fossil fuels, Qatar has fuels, but Lebanon has none, although it is said that there is oil offshore. In terms of minerals, the situation is the reverse. Lebanon has minerals, especially limestone and iron ore, which is used to make steel. Qatar, on the other hand, has no minerals. Does the presence or absence of natural resources affect human development?
(1.7)
So, we've heard about some of the geographical features of these two countries. Now, the key question is, what is the Human Development Index of each of these two countries? As you know, this index is a measure of life expectancy, literacy, education in general, and standards of living. The figure for Qatar is very high, at 0.831. For Lebanon, the figure is slightly lower, at 0.739. Okay, so I want you to think about the key question for our next tutorial. Does geography affect human development? Both Qatar and Lebanon have quite a high figure. They are both in the top half of the table of world countries. But Qatar's figure is higher than Lebanon's. Why?
1.8 Lesson 1.3 Learning New Listening Skills Using Lecture Structure. Exercise A2. Listen to some sentences from the lecture and check your ideas. 1.
Some people include things like forests in natural resources
2.
and temperature range from the coldest to the hottest.
3.
So we've heard about some of the geographical features of the two countries.
4.
Some countries have a very low population density.
5.
Density means the average number of people per square kilometre.
6.
But more important, really, is the amount of agricultural land.
7.
They are fossil fuels and minerals.
(1.9) Exercise C. Listen to the introductions to 3 lectures. Lecture 1, Time Management.
Okay, so this week I'm going to talk about time management. There are 2 main topics or areas within time management. Firstly, managing people, and secondly, managing things. So that's people and things. But under each heading, we have several subheadings. So under the heading People, we have 3 subheadings: colleagues, employees, and most important of all, the boss. While under the heading Things, we have 3 more subheadings. They are work, energy, and unfortunately, distractions.
Lecture 2, Memory.
So, where have we got to? Right, yes, memory. This week, I want to summarise everything about this subject so far. So first, I'm going to look at the process of remembering, which involves 3 stages, according to the multi-stage memory model. We will look at each stage again. That's sensory, short-term and long-term. Then I'm going to go quickly through the types of memory. If you remember, there are 4 main types of memory. Firstly, of course, there is autobiographical memory, like name, date of birth, personal holidays. Then, secondly, there is procedural memory, which is how to do things like drive a car. Thirdly, we have stories, like fairy tales. Finally, shocking events, sometimes called flashbulb memory, because it is like a picture of a moment in our heads.
Lecture 3, Desertification. In today's session, I want to give you an overview of desertification. In the first part of the lecture, I'm going to describe the causes of desertification. We will look at 3 main causes: climate change, then farming methods, and finally deforestation. That means cutting down trees. Then, in the second part of the lecture, I will describe some ways of greening the desert, that is, reversing the process. (1.10) Exercise D2. Listen and check your answers. During the lecture.
Okay, so that's climate. Now, let's look at natural resources. Right, we've heard about fossil fuels. What about minerals? Next, natural resources. Let's move on to minerals.
After the lecture.
I missed the bit about fossil fuels. What did she say about climate type? Did you get the information for average rainfall?
(1.11) Exercise E1. Listen to an introduction to a lecture about communication. Prepare a page for your notes with scientific numbering.
I want to talk to you today about communication. We communicate, or perhaps I should say, we try to communicate all the time. But communication, real communication, is not easy. so I'm going to talk about the process of communication. Firstly, I'm going to talk about barriers to communication. There are several main barriers to communication. I'm going to look at 5. We have physical barriers. For example, you can't hear me well. Then there are mental barriers. You can't understand my ideas. There are linguistic barriers, of course, if we don't have a common language. Fourthly, emotional barriers. Perhaps you are angry with me. Finally, there are cultural barriers. Perhaps we have a different view of the communication. So, 5 main barriers. I will look at each one in more detail. Then, in the second half, I will talk about breaking down the barriers. In this section, I'm going to mention 2 ideas. Firstly, the role of the information giver, and secondly, the role of the information receiver. So that's giver and receiver. Okay, let's start with barriers.
(1.12) Exercise E2. Listen to the first part. Make notes.
Okay, let's start with barriers to communication. Firstly, physical barriers. This is really quite obvious, but sometimes people try to communicate, even quite important messages, in completely the wrong place. For example, a lecturer tries to announce an assignment at the end of a lecture when the students have already started to get up, walk around, talk. It is better to announce information like this in a quiet room and to make sure that everyone can hear you and everyone is listening. You must remember that people need to be able to hear you and preferably to see you as well. Seeing a speaker helps you to understand the words. Secondly, we have mental barriers. There are 2 possible reasons for mental barriers: me and you. Perhaps you don't understand me because I have not formed my ideas clearly, or because I don't express them clearly. Perhaps you don't understand me because you are not paying attention, or you are not knowledgeable enough or clever enough to understand them. We shall see in the second part how to deal with this barrier, whether it starts with the speaker or the listener. Thirdly, there can be linguistic barriers. I'm sure you're very familiar with those, so I'm not going to dwell on it. Fourthly, emotional barriers, which can be the worst kind of all. You cannot understand perfectly what someone is saying to you if you are in an emotional state, angry, depressed, worried. Of course, you can't express yourself perfectly in those circumstances, either. Finally, cultural barriers.
(1.13) Lesson 1.4. Grammar for listening. Both, neither. And, but. Whereas, while. Grammar box 1. Both countries are located in the Middle East. Both countries have hot, dry summers. Both countries have a small land area. Both countries have some natural resources. Neither country is large in area. Neither country has a large population. Neither country has much agricultural land. Neither country has any mining industries. (1.14) Exercise A. Listen to an extract from a lecture about Singapore and Tonga.
Okay, now we're going to look at 2 island nations, Singapore and Tonga. Singapore is in Southeast Asia and Tonga is in Western Polynesia in the South Pacific. They have some similarities but many differences. One is very successful in economic terms and very rich. The other is not very successful economically and is quite poor. What role has geography played in these differences? Anyway, let's consider the similarities first. Obviously, both countries are surrounded by water, but Tonga has over 170 beautiful tropical islands, and Singapore has about 50. However, Many of Tonga's islands are uninhabited, and in the case of Singapore, only the large main island is important. Surprisingly, perhaps, tourism is not a major part of the economy in Tonga, although the government has plans to develop this industry. Now, my next point. Both countries are small in land area and both have small populations. We'll look at the actual figures later. Let's look at climate. As you've probably guessed already, the two countries have a tropical climate, and neither has any actual deserts. On the other hand, neither has much rainfall in summer. Unlike desert climates, both countries have high temperatures in summer and in winter, whereas of course deserts can be cold in winter. And lastly, both countries are very flat and neither has any mountains.
(1.15) Exercise B. Listen to another extract about Singapore and Tonga.
So we have seen some of the similarities between Tonga and Singapore. Now let's consider the differences between these island nations. I said that both are small, but there are big differences between them. Singapore has an area of 660 square kilometres, and Tonga has 748. However, Singapore is much bigger in terms of population. Singapore has around 5 million people, and the population density is very high, at over 7,000 per square kilometre. In fact, it is one of the most densely populated or crowded countries in the world. Tonga, on the other hand, has a much smaller population at 122,000 and a much lower density of 165. Many of its islands, in fact, are uninhabited. Both countries are flat, as we have heard. The highest point in Singapore, Bukit Timah, is at 166 metres, against 1,033 metres in Tonga. The area in Tonga has no name, by the way. What about agricultural land? Well, Singapore only has 1% agricultural land. Yes, that's right, 1%. Whereas nearly half of Tongan land is under cultivation. 48% to be precise. The wettest month in Singapore is December, which has an average of 288 millimetres, while Tonga's is March at 210. So there is not a significant difference there. Now, we heard about the agricultural land in Singapore. Well, the lack of agricultural land, I should say. There is no agricultural land because the whole main island is one large city. So most people in Singapore live in the city, and the urban-rural split is 100-0. But Tonga is very different. Only 25% of people live in towns. Finally, Singapore is a very rich country with a GDP per capita of $57,000, which is third place in the world, while Tonga only has a GDP per capita of $2,900. Okay, what does all this mean for the HDI? Which is higher, do you think? Let's see. The HDI for Singapore is 0.846, which means it is 27th in the world. By contrast, the figure for Tonga is 0.677, which puts it in 85th place. Why is Singapore higher? Does the remote location of Tonga give it a major disadvantage?
(1.16) Lesson 1.5 Applying new listening skills. Pakistan and Chile. Exercise A2. Listen and check your answers. Mark the main stressed syllable in each word or phrase.
Region and borders come under location. Density and urban-rural split are concerned with population. Area, agricultural, and lakes and rivers describe land. Rainfall and temperature range are part of climate. Fossil fuels and minerals come under natural resources.
(1.17)
I'm going to talk today about two large countries, There are many similarities between the countries, but there are also some differences. As you know, when we analyse the geography of a country, we look at 5 areas: location, population, land, climate, and natural resources. Then, as before, at the end of the lecture, I'm going to give you the Human Development Index number, or HDI, for each country. Like last time, I'm going to ask you to consider this question: does geography affect human development in these countries? First then, location. We need to consider region and borders. Now, one country, Pakistan, is in Western Asia, whereas the other, Chile, is in South America. Pakistan is bordered in the east by India, in the west by Iran and Afghanistan, and in the north by China. Chile has borders with Peru in the north, Bolivia in the northeast, and Argentina in the east. Chile also has a very long coastline on the South Pacific Ocean. Okay, let's look at population now. As before, I'm going to look at 3 sub-areas under this heading: the total population, the density, and the urban-rural split. Now, Pakistan has a large population, but Chile's is quite small. The population of Pakistan is 185 million, whereas Chile's population is around 10% of that size, at 17.3 million. Pakistan, therefore, has a much higher density of population than Chile. 177 people per square kilometre against 20 per square kilometre. What about the urban-rural split? Well, the population of Pakistan is more rural than the population of Chile. The split in Pakistan is 34 to 66, whereas in Chile it is 87 to 13. Now, thirdly, land. As you know, we consider area, percentage of agricultural land, and availability of natural water, that is, lakes and rivers. Both countries are large. In fact, they are almost the same size. Pakistan has an area of 803,000 square kilometres, while Chile is slightly smaller at 756,000 square kilometres. Both countries have quite a high percentage of agricultural land. Pakistan has 30% of agricultural land and Chile has 21%. Both countries have permanent lakes and rivers. The most important river of Pakistan is the Indus, while the most important river of Chile is the Lower. Fourthly, climate. If you remember, in this area, we consider the broad type of climate. Then we look at the average annual rainfall and temperature range. Both countries are very large, so they have different climates in different areas. In fact, Chile has every main type of climate, from desert through Mediterranean to Arctic in the extreme south. Both countries have desert regions in the north of the country. The rainfall range in Pakistan is much lower than in Chile. In Pakistan, rainfall ranges from 125 millimetres, which is very low, to 1,500 millimetres, which is very high. Meanwhile, in Chile, average rainfall is between 0.2 millimetres in the north and 2,900 in the south. The temperature range is also wider in Chile, whereas in Pakistan there is a temperature range throughout the year between 13 degrees Celsius and 34 degrees Celsius. In Chile the range is much bigger, between minus 18, that's minus 18 degrees Celsius, and plus 38 degrees Celsius. Finally, natural resources. As you know, we can divide natural resources into fossil fuels and minerals. Both countries have coal, but Chile also has a small amount of oil and natural gas. With regard to minerals, both countries have iron ore and copper. Okay, so we've heard about some of the geographic features of the two countries. What are their HDI ratings? They're very different. On the one hand, the HDI for Pakistan is 0.504, which puts it in the bottom half of the world countries. On the other hand, the HDI for Chile is 0.805, which means Chile is in the top half. Why is there a difference? Is it connected to geography?